Bungalow Bill here, and welcome back to From the Depths. The long-related stable branch release has finally been dropped, and I do not believe that the patch notes on From the Depths website are comprehensive. I've gone back through those patch notes as late as March 2021 and tried to figure out what's been released to stable, what's been released to beta, what's been released to alpha, and as a result, what's actually changing in stable. So this is both a combination of my memory and the patch notes. There have been many changes with no patch notes at all. So the unreliability of the patch notes plus the unreliability of my memory means that it's likely that I will either say things that have already been released to stable, or will be missing some things that are being released to stable, but hopefully this will still be a decent overview regardless. I'm going to start out with the change that might bring the most trepidation, and is really the largest meta shaker of many of the changes here, and that is, of course, stability. And I'm just going to start by reading off the patch notes, and then try to give some scenarios, although we're watching this water skimmer because water skimmers are one of the most heavily affected craft as far as stability is concerned. Acceleration and evasion being very cheap and having basically no downside is a very old FDD problem. It makes cannons unreliable, ships relatively weak, and kiting disproportionately strong. The new stability mechanic adds a benefit for having a stable platform. Overview. New stat. Stability. Possible range is 0 to 100%. It's based on the movement of the main construct in the last 3 seconds. Added a slider to the target prioritization AI card from -1000 to 1000 value for each 1% stability. This is actually almost as important as the stability stat itself. Munition Warner range is now a function of stability. Instead of rotation rate, varies between 20 to 110% for 0 to 100% stability. All direct fire weapons gain 0.004 degrees in accuracy for each 1% stability below 100%. Which means at 0% stability, it's 0.4 degrees in accuracy. This is noticeable, but not massive. Missile laser target inaccuracy is rerolled every second, and the actual inaccuracy of the beam is interpolated to the new value over 1 second. Remote and Lua missile error is increased by 0.1 meter for each 1%, so this caps out at 10 meters. It's roughly double the base rate for remote guided missiles. It's significant against small targets, not huge against large targets. 4 values are tracked to create the stability stat. Average velocity magnitude, also known as speed. Velocity magnitude change, the change in your speed. Velocity rotation rate times velocity magnitude. This isn't the heading of your craft. This is the rotation in the change of the direction that your craft is moving in, times its speed. And construct rotation rate, so the actual heading of your craft. It's unclear to me exactly how these things are being combined. I find that some of these by themselves make large changes, and others seem to need multiple of them working in conjunction to actually tank your stability. Simply accelerating with a high amount of thrust from a standstill will immediately crater your stability down to about 0%. You'll see this on a lot of high-powered flyers or water skimmers right as they take off. Others aren't so harmful by themselves. Simply having a high velocity, but moving in a very stable manner, unlike this water skimmer, which we've been seeing is bouncing very slightly, will not really hurt your stability quite as much. But the slight bouncing motion, in addition to just the forward velocity, does actually matter quite a bit. Further examples, ships generally have 95 to 100% stability. A flyer moving in a straight line at 220 meters per second has 90% stability. Circling at 2,000 meters distance, but the same speed, is 75% stability. And then circling at 1,000 meters distance and the same speed is 65% stability. Now, let's take a quick look at some examples other than the one that we've been watching. Here we have a relatively small and narrow boat. Stability was a little low when I spawned it in, partially because it dropped into the water, partially because it accelerated, but it's about 99% now in calm waters. Very slight amount of roll going in a straight line, 25 meters per second. Let's change the environmental options. Fixed weather quality, 1, wave factor 4, and we'll watch the waves at some point become incredibly large. So this craft would not be effective with this kind of wave factor. These waves are just way too big for it. It's going to spend a lot of its time not really being able to see things with its detection properly, shooting through too much water to really do anything. Its stability, however, is not that affected. Part of it is just because the gravity in Neater is really pretty low, so it bobbing through the waves is not actually that violent in action compared to lift jets or that sort of thing. Also, it has some severe speed issues because it's getting high-centered by the waves. So, I've tested this before. The stability can go as low as maybe 60%, but it's pretty rare, and it still spends most of its time pretty high despite the extreme wave action. Yeah, so we got 62% there. So let's change the waves to something slightly more reasonable that is more likely to be seen in the game. This is more consistent with the conditions of the cold lock. And this ship could possibly function at. It's sort of the absolute borderline for what this ship could function at. Now it's relatively stable. That first bob was just it transitioning between the different wave actions. So here we are completely leaving the water and basically completely submerging, getting down to around 70% stability. This is still not enough to really penalize this ship. The ship is still going to function just fine. And it's relatively narrow. If memory serves, okay, so it does have some roll stability. Memory does not serve. I want to take out its pitch and roll control, which actually might capsize it entirely. It is a little bit of a narrow craft. I think it also has, it does not have pitch on the back. Okay, so now it has absolutely nothing stabilizing roll and nothing stabilizing pitch. However, really, FTD boats usually don't roll that badly. They can if they catch a wave just wrong, or are very tall or are very buoyant, but it's usually not a massive problem. Got down to 69% there, but still not a huge deal. Alright, here I've spawned in the new tier, which is way scarier than the old tier, also way more expensive. Memory serves, it uses AP frag and AP heat railguns, and a lot of heavy armor, and then the Caldera. And the reason the Caldera is coming in here is because these types of Lightning Hood ships are some of the worst affected of the actual craft that are in Neater. And this is roughly the inaccuracy that it gets. Because, well, all of this lasers have 0.05 degrees inaccuracy, so this is really just from the stability. It's of course going to slow down pretty soon because these railgun shells are messing it up pretty badly, and we'll see these lasers become a bit more coherent as it loses its ability to thrust. So it's still moving a little bit, but that gives a pretty good idea. It prevents it from just boring a hole through exactly one block, but for a relatively large target like the tier, it's not really going to be actually missing any shots with a laser. However, if this was shooting at a smaller target, like a small helicopter or something that could still deploy smoke and be a little bit evasive and just small enough that it might miss, 50 to 75% of the laser pulses, this is actually a very noticeable decrease in DPS to the Caldera in those scenarios. What this tends to mean is that fighting at a long distance and being highly maneuverable is still very much to your benefit in these sorts of capital ship clashes, because if the Caldera was bobbing a little bit, it could be dodging the tier shots to a reasonable degree, and if it was firing back with something that does more damage and isn't hard countered by smoke, like railguns or that sort of thing, it would just clobber the tier. On the other hand, if it was trying to hit very small ships, it would see a much harsher penalty. So this is not as big a change as it sort of seems like on face value in a lot of cases, but it does shake up the meta a little bit. Some other unstable crafts, like fighters that rely on missiles that have their own guidance, those are unaffected. Ones that use guns but still fire at relatively close range, well, those aren't affected that much because the inaccuracy just doesn't matter as much if you're firing within maybe 800 meters or so. 0.4 degrees inaccuracy barely matters. Bombers, whether they're pack bombers, CRAM bombers, that sort of thing, they usually fire at such close ranges that the inaccuracy from stability is just pretty trivial compared to the dodginess of the enemy vehicle, although that sort of is a factor at most ranges with anything other than a hit scan weapon. So that said, hit scan weapons you'll see the most effects on. Weapons with travel times, relative movement during the travel time is still going to be a larger contributing factor than the inaccuracy for most cases. Alright, so another fairly large change that's coming in are the custom propellers, and these are replacing the Deady blades, which are not being removed from the game but instead deprecated, so they can't be put into new designs. However, old designs using them will continue to function. The custom propellers do what was being promised for a long time with Deady blades. They now require clearance to function, and unlike a lot of air blocks that require clearance, there is no distance limit on these checks, so you can't just give them 8 meters of air gap and expect them to work while fully sealed. They need unlimited air gap. When hovering over them, it shows the clearance that they need, and then full blockage is in orange and half blockage is in yellow. Their thrust per power at 40 is exceptional for air movement. It brings it really on par with the best water movement. Their total thrust is dependent on the area that they sweep, so they become more cost effective in terms of upfront cost the larger they're made. However, they're pretty cheap to begin with, so this is not necessarily a huge concern. Their efficiency in terms of power use does not vary based on how large they are, so the running cost is the same even if you use a bunch of small ones compared to one big one. The time to reach 100% thrust is dependent on how large they are, so if you find your craft is unstable because the propellers are taking too long to spin up and spin down, try either just using smaller propellers or more propellers that are smaller. For example, a helicopter with reasonably realistically sized blades, you may find that the time to reach 100% thrust is simply too high, and it makes a helicopter that's almost impossible to stabilize because our built-in PIDs are not equipped to deal with reaction time on control surfaces or thrust blocks, that kind of thing. And generally, you really need nearly instantaneous response relative to how quickly your vehicle maneuvers to get good performance. If the green area has a blockage in it, the blade will not operate at all. And that's mostly all there is to them. You can do some very interesting things aesthetically with them. The defaults are fine, but not fantastic. However, in extra configuration, there is a lot of stuff that you can do. You can move individual blades so that you can get a 3-blade configuration to actually look good. Now, is this necessary compared to just having a button that equally distributes them around, or maybe even changes the visible number of blades and has them equally distributed? Probably not, but it does offer more flexibility in case that's something that you need. This allows for the blade's visual properties to be specified at different locations on the blade, and then it interpolates between them when generating the blade. Very interesting. I believe that this winds up using some interpolated NURBs, which are notoriously difficult to get to do what you need to do compared to control point NURBs. So you may find this very difficult to get to do exactly what you want it to do. Personally, I find it extremely difficult to get it to do exactly what I want, but you can get some very nice looking blades out of it if you spend a lot of time really messing with it. Oh dear. I wasn't sure if you could get them to move past each other like that. You can, that's interesting. Anyway, that's really what there is to do with these. I've not really used them on any of my ships that are currently on the workshop. I have used them in the Live Wood Kneader series, so you'll have seen some of their effects there. The disadvantages of these is that you do have to put them exposed outside of your craft. The advantages to them is that if you can deal with their downside, they're just a better way of lifting your craft than anything else available in the game. Something else that I want to look at while it's in the topic of thrust is that there is now automatic balancing. So if I look at this thruster, it is set to automatic control, where the game just decides that this thruster should be assigned to 1 forwards, pitch up because it's below the center of mass, and that's pretty much it. This one just forward because it's almost exactly in line with the center of mass, and this one pitch down. For some reason that I do not understand, it's also set to up for 1 and down for 0.97. What I have found is that this is almost completely useless, because just what you get often makes no sense. Up 1, down 1. I really don't know. So basically all this has done is every time you place a thruster, you have to change it to manual control, and you have to do this for every single block. It's really annoying. There have been a lot of complaints about how much this doesn't work, and it's really never been made to work better. It is a very promising mechanic if they can get it to work properly. And the reason it's so promising is because it does a lot of stuff, like attempt to balance out your craft in a way that updates when thrusters are destroyed, repaired, disabled due to coming in and out of the water, when they change orientation because the sub-object that they're on changes. So something that you can't do now without using a breadboard or Lua or that kind of thing, maybe ACBs, although ACBs are not a good use for this, is put a sub-object as you jet or something, so a custom jet engine that pivots. When it's pivoted 90 degrees, I want the CJE to now respond to the right control rather than the forward. So even if my craft isn't trying to go forwards, if it's just trying to turn in place, it'll still fire this custom jet engine. Currently, you have to set this sort of thing up with breadboards. But maybe at some point in the future, this balance setup will work properly, and that sort of thing will be handled automatically. I'm hopeful that with this being unstable and more people looking through it and maybe more complaints being sent to the developers, that at some point here we'll get somewhere good. And for comparison against this propeller hub, at maximum efficiency, the jet engine is 25 thrust per power. If I had fuel, which I promise I meant to put here, this drops to 16.7. If I spin this up, it stays at 40. That's just a fantastic increase in efficiency. Even if you compare it to custom jet engines, it's still really good. Something else that has been changing a lot on the alpha and beta test branches have been breadboards, and in particular, the flagship change has been the generic block getter and the generic block setter. Here's just a very simple usage of them where I've set them up for a single precision spin block, which you can see holding a very blurry wood beam behind the circuit board. Here, I can set the angle, and then here it adjusts to different angles. I have the rate set fairly slow, so you can see the lag time. This is particularly useful because breadboards didn't have a great way of doing this in the past, and now that rotation rates depend on the amount of mass, you couldn't just do math to figure out where it would be. You actually need feedback if you're manipulating spin blocks from the breadboard. So this is a fantastic addition. There's also a bunch of other things that can be affected by the block getters and block setters. Still a few things that can't be. Hopefully this stuff will slowly be added in. Nick has been collecting feedback and slowly putting new things in. Hopefully there will be more to come. Additionally, something that's been changing is the breadboard has just been getting made more stable. Previously, it'd been kind of easy to just break physics when you were working on the breadboard and hooked up things that really didn't make sense yet. A lot of that stuff has been fixed, so just fantastic stability improvements for it. And the game in general, I have not had a crash in... I feel like it's been about a month now since my game has crashed, whereas at one point I was getting, crashes multiple times an hour, so just wonderful stability improvements for everything, really, that they've been hammering away at. A lot of them in silent patches, too, where they don't really say anything, they just fix a bunch of stuff. Now, the breadboard still does need more help, because it can't do everything, so you need to do some things with ACBs. You can look at the kitty kami, for example, of one of my ships on the Steam Workshop, which you can find a link to the Steam Workshop either from this video's description or my channel's About section. It uses the generic block getter and generic block setter to interact with ACBs to do things that cannot be done just simply from the breadboard. However, it does some really hacky stuff because of the fact that, as far as I can tell, ACBs and breadboards just do not have an inherent way that they run in time compared to each other. You can set priorities on ACBs, and it changes their execution order, but there's no reliable order between breadboards and ACBs, so you don't know in any one frame if they'll run before or after. And in subsequent frames, that ordering will not be the same. It means that using generic block getters and setters for ACBs, or, well, generic block setters, at least for ACBs, is unreliable at best, and is not something that can really be relied on in any meaningful fashion if you need frame-perfect exchanges, like my example of changing particle cannon lenses. So hopefully some more stuff to be improved on in the future, but a lot of good stuff for breadboards. There's also just little things that have been going on. Here it is, it took me a while to find. Some of the breadboard stuff has been getting a treatment to allow more mathematically compact versions of some stuff, and to avoid you needing to marshal as much stuff from one format to another. So you can do things like get your craft rotation either as a vector, or you can get one of its directions, or a quaternion. So a lot of breadboards stuff used to just be getting things like taking this, a bunch of these, and doing stuff with it, and then enemy position, your position, some stuff you couldn't even get at that point that you had to estimate. And just doing a lot of very boilerplate math. A lot of that stuff can now be much condensed, so stuff like my PN breadboard doesn't have to be so disgustingly large if I was to do it nowadays, because really it doesn't do very much math. It just does a lot of boilerplate that shouldn't really be necessary. CRAM cannons have been giving a graphical makeover. Now, they've been made just much sleeker, which is really consistent with other things like fuel engines. it always takes me a little bit of time to get used to these changes because when I look at the meshes, I can't really tell what they're supposed to be anymore. You know, you get used to how things look. And the old payload packer was just the way the mesh was in respect to how it functioned was terrible. This, though, this is nice, right? You can tell what this is supposed to do immediately. This won't take that long to get used to. And there have just been a few other small things. So you get stuff like gauge increase ports and gauge increase top 3 connections, just stuff that reduces the amount of connectivity on your gauge increasers so that you can do sort of better multi-barrel CRAM setup than you could in the past. It's not huge. You could work around these issues before, but it is nice to have them. There have been some changes in movement parts, and I'm not sure how much of that is already unstable and how much of it is not, but there are things like custom jet engines, which have a yaw and pitch, and these can be adjusted through the generic block setters. Now, there are more options than there used to be in terms of control surfaces, and they've been readjusted. But thrust vectoring is still king for reasons that we're going to discuss later, so if you can do this, it's always worth doing. And additionally, there are some automatic options here. They're not necessarily terribly useful, but they can give you just a little edge to craft sometimes, so that if you have a thruster craft that pitches to target slightly, this sort of thing can make it stop drifting forwards or backwards so quickly and save you a little bit of efficiency without having to do work with a breadboard and that sort of thing to handle it for you automatically. Not something that I use so much, but something that is potentially useful. There are things like large rudders, which I believe have been in for a long time. However, you don't need to use them on spin blocks. You have pivots, and those pivots can interact with other rudder sections. This one's pointing backwards, but it doesn't really matter for this purpose, and turn the whole thing around. And just in general, large rudders and their air counterparts are now about 10 times stronger than they used to be. Really, this is what's intended to be used now. They do have slightly slow response times, and they create, and along with all similar control blocks, they create drag in response to the force that they create. I believe it's 75% of the force. The reason for this is so that if you take, I mean, it could be anything, but it's mostly in response to the fact that you could take 2 of these, put them on spin blocks, or, you know, at angles 45 degrees opposed to each other, and if they didn't have a sufficient amount of drag, you would just get free forward velocity out of them until your craft, it would grow exponentially until your craft just catapults out of existence if your craft's drag wasn't enough to counteract this, which when people made ornithopters and that sort of thing, it's why they went, you know, the speed of light and crashed into the ground at ridiculous speeds. So I do hope that this will change a little bit in the future and maybe be dependent on angle of attack, so that if you do relatively slight corners, you get better lift to drag ratios because you're still not getting energy out of nowhere. And it would bring you into things like energy conserving turns and that kind of thing, which currently don't exist in From the Depths. It would also allow for heavy bombers and that sort of thing to have highly efficient lift sources and not have to plow through the air so badly. I think it would open up a lot of design space compared to what the current meta is, with lift jets and thrust vectoring just being king over the control surfaces at the moment. But, you know, liable to change if they ever actually do something like that. I hope they will, but maybe they won't. Just in general, there are a few exceptions, so Armor 1 here, but most control surfaces are way more heavily armored than they used to be. And this was done to intentionally nerf flak shells out of the game, because apparently their massive explosive damage radius was incredibly bad for performance, so now they've just been relegated to anti-missile systems where they don't destroy the game's performance as badly. I don't necessarily agree that this is a great way to handle things, but certainly is a way to handle things. The 1x1 wing blocks, they're gone. You're now supposed to use these, which they get simulated as one block and apply one force, so supposedly they're a lot more efficient. Things like the hydrofoils, these are way more expensive than they used to be. I believe they used to cost 3. They're slightly tougher, I think. They create more lift than they used to, and they have a slower response rate, but it's still way, way faster than custom rudders. So if you need something that's very responsive in the water, you can use these, but I believe the intention is that you'll use these. And for a water skimmer, a lot of the time for a water skimmer, you just sort of want it to bounce on top. So you can just set the custom rudder max upwards and just call it a day. Now, rudders do work a little bit in the air. It's less powerful, but it's still noticeable. So this can get you into trouble a little bit. It's the reason why the ones that I have on the Damocles, you can check it out on the Steam Workshop, are responsive, which means that they suffer from the fact that this rate is actually kind of slow, but usually isn't a huge deal. Now, I cannot for the life of me remember what the current state of melee weapons is on Stable. There's nothing about them in the patch notes going way back on Stable Branch, or even for the current 3.5.5 release, so I feel like I will mention them, although I did talk about them a little bit. Well, that's fortunate that this has so much rams and rubber on it, but so I did talk about them a little bit on the video about this craft, although I didn't talk about the changes so much as just what they are, for things like how rams store impact damage, so that now it's not really infinite like it was at one point, where if you just use spin blocks to clip rams into the enemy vehicles, that you can do almost infinite. I mean, at one point you could do almost infinite amounts of damage to them. Things like the Reamer, if you saw in my beta diplomacy playthrough how it would just annihilate million cost chips by itself, no longer capable of doing that. Instead, we've got stuff like large steam trolls. I mean, you can still use simple rams. They still do a lot of damage, especially on heavier vehicles, but they're really just more effective on massive battleships that maybe use CRAM cannons and want to get close anyway, and don't require additional changes or additional cost to use the rams. You just put them on and get a lot of bonus damage. The steam drills, on the other hand, require a much larger investment, can give you a lot of benefit as a result. Check out the video on this, or download it from the Steam Workshop if you want to see the effectiveness. It's a little unpredictable because rubber stops them cold, and there's a little bit of jankiness to melee in general. The particle accelerator cannon melee, well, it's halved compared to how it used to be, I believe to a times 10 damage rather than times 20. So apparently it had to be nerfed like that because it was too powerful. Personally, I don't think it's good. Maybe people who have messed around with it more than me have crafts that are just degenerate with it and really needed that nerf. I found that due to how delicate the lenses are, it's very difficult to make a pack melee craft that really works. But there's things that I haven't done, like make a very compact one that doesn't have its own source of energy production and is very cheap in the 10 to 20k range. It just crashes into an enemy vehicle with a very long little bladed thing on the melee pack to just sort of lance through it and maybe disable enemy vehicles at a cheap cost. But my experiments with them on slightly larger vehicles have been largely failures due to the frailty of melee pack lenses and how difficult they are to protect. the one block that has really been unaffected by these changes, and I've never really seen used anywhere. There was talk on the Grey Talons channel in the Discord for a while about someone who was trying to use them on one of their vehicles, is the laser cutter. If you've seen my video that's titled something like Close Combat Prototypes and has a Rick and Morty meme in the thumbnail, I try to use laser cutters there. I find them to be wildly unreliable. I've had a bunch of theories about why they just don't do what they say they do sometimes, and I go and test these theories and find that they're wrong, so I really have no idea. But their potential is still incredible compared to any other melee system. There's a lot of untapped potential if you can figure out how to use these properly. Applies 10 times more damage and 10 times more AP, then this will probably get fixed eventually when fired from a laser combiner. So effectively 100 times the firepower of a normal laser system. Another way to think about it is you get to pretend that the enemies don't have smoke and do 10 times damage. Which, if you know how lightning hoods craft annihilate anything without smoke on them, obviously horrifyingly powerful. This is the kind of damage that if an enemy craft is relatively the same cost to yours, and you can actually get them decently with a laser cutter and do the damage the laser cutter is supposed to do, you could reasonably just destroy every single block on the enemy vehicle. So I'm revisiting laser cutters. Hopefully I'll get something viable with it. I don't know. I really don't know why. That sometimes these do the advertised damage for me, and sometimes they do less than a laser combiner should, and I, for the life of me, have never figured it out. But they're still here, and they're still unchanged from how they've been unstable for a long time. Additionally, there have been a fairly large number of just miscellaneous changes that have been made. A diplomacy victory is now possible in Niter, where if no one is at war and you have 75 or greater relationship with everyone, you will just immediately win. In theory, this is being added into other versions as well, so Ashes of the Empire and Glau. Weapons no longer attempt to fire through terrain. You can actually see this a bit in my Livewood Niter playthrough recently, where one of my ships wasn't trying to shoot at enemies through terrain. I really had no idea why that wasn't happening, but apparently it was because of this change. There is now a Shift-E menu when you're building that lets you do useful stuff. Most of it's available in other menus as well, but there's a little bit of new stuff there. There's an orthographic camera. The issue with APS occasionally firing blank shots has been fixed. The rotational wobble of tractor beams has been removed. This is likely largely due to the stability change and how it affected the Twin Guard, which I would be really happy if it just removed the whole mech building thing that Twin Guards do. But I guess this was the change instead. The translucency render pipeline has been reverted. So that caused a bunch of issues that were going on for a long time, and they didn't all get resolved, so that all got pulled out. Let's actually take a quick look at the orthographic camera, which shows a lot of promise, because if you've done any CAD modeling or that sort of thing, you spent a long time using orthographic cameras. They can be fantastic. The version that you're about to see here is a little horrifying. I'm going to make something that's a little long and does something like this, maybe to give some idea. No, it's not great, but it's good enough. I'm probably a long distance away. No, I'm not. And you have to do it from, because you don't have to do it from build mode, but I'll go back into build mode and do it. So you can see that I'm getting perspective here, which means that it's sort of like my eye is a point. It's looking through a rectangular viewport, and there's sort of this viewing cone. If I was to put the overlay on so that I could click on things, there's now a camera options thing, screenshot, green screen, which turns off the skybox. Can turn off a lot of other stuff. Enable/disable orthographic view. This disables terrain and ocean rendering. Now, rendering things in orthographic mode is very different from rendering things in perspective mode. presumably they'll make orthographic projection more functional in the future. I know personally I work on Onshape, which, if you want to see the difference between orthographic and projection rendering, you can go to cad.onshape.com and look at some model, and on the little view icon button thing on the right, you can switch between orthographic and perspective. A lot of our functionality doesn't work in perspective because some of the calculations it does with respect to the camera are different in perspective mode. So this is what this looks like in orthographic projection, where if you sort of, the way to look at it is that everything in the world is being smushed flat. So rather than your sightlines sort of diverging from your eyeball along a cone, everything is projected at a rectangle. In a rectangle, no matter how far something is from you, it will always look the same size. Unfortunately, this has some render distance issues, so it's not really usable at the moment. You can kind of get an idea about how things are different because, despite all of the very weirdness of the fact that with, no terrain and ocean rendering, we're just getting this really, really bizarre, I even hesitate to call it a skybox, like whatever is going on here. But you can see that we're not getting any perspective lines or that sort of thing anymore. And most people who have done mechanical design use this a lot. It is hard to tell what your thing looks like in this mode, and you have to switch back to perspective to actually know what your thing looks like. If they get this camera to actually work, I don't know why it's going to a stable build like this, but if they get this to work, it'll be a useful tool to the game. There's also, all this other stuff if you want to be in outer space. Oh, actually, that works a lot better, doesn't it? There's still some render distance issues. The stuff is getting clipped way too early. The way that clipping works for perspective and orthographic is a lot different. Because, for example, you can get things behind you in perspective mode. That's not something that makes sense in an orthographic projection. There's nothing that you're converging to in an orthographic projection. Another small change that I do not remember if it's unstable, but I suspect it is not, because I've had complaints for the 5th season where people say that the propellers are not connected, and the propellers rely on these large wheels in order to be connected. You can connect ones that are in the same plane and within a certain distance of each other and have the same RPMs, so basically you don't use transmission blocks. So now the 5th season should actually work on stable, along with any of my other recent craft. Definitely check some of them out to see some of the differences in the alpha test sort of showcased, because I have been trying to use them. So this engine, this could just use 3 large gearboxes. Large gearboxes, not expensive, don't really drain, and when it comes down to it, they don't drain that much kinetic energy per second. It's way more than a wheel, but given the amount of energy this thing puts out, it's not that much, so, could definitely just use 3 of these. I could just put this thing in a longer line, starting back here, going up here, moving the AI compartment somewhere else, maybe on top, maybe below, I don't know. But this is sort of a fun thing to do, that instead of using the 3 gearboxes, it just combines all of this into one, because if one of these stages gets taken out, it's taking out the whole engine anyway. Definitely not good for redundancy, but good for it's good for performance. I mean, game performance, not vehicle performance, as well as block count, that kind of thing. Realistically, okay, you know, could do 2 smaller steam engines, that sort of thing. It would be better. A lot of my other crafts really showcase how to do redundancy a bit better than this. Definitely not something to take off for that respect to it, but it does show something you can do with these. The Damocles uses it to power multiple steam drills. You can use it to gang up multiple crank motors to drive one propeller at higher efficiency. Or just what the 5th season does, and use it to have one steam engine drive a lot of propellers, because steam engines are just way too powerful to drive normal propellers. Well, that's everything that I could think of for changes. As I said at the beginning, maybe some of them are already unstable, maybe I missed some of them, but hopefully this was somewhat educational anyway. I hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope to see you in the future.